Absolutely. Here's part 1, expanded to around 1,300 words, in simple, engaging English. Third-person style, and with no inappropriate content, Mrs. Ellis was 97 years old. She had lived in the same house for over 70 years. Was not very big or fancy, but it was full of memories. It stood on a quiet street with a garden full of flowers that she took care of herself. Most of her neighbors had moved away or passed on, and now Mrs. Ellis often found herself feeling alone in the large, quiet rooms. For a long time, Mrs. Ellis was unsure if she wanted to leave the house. Every wall, every window, and every chair held a memory. She remembered raising her children here. She remembered the laughter and the tears, the birthday parties, and the long, peaceful evenings with her late husband. But as she grew older, it became harder for her to manage things on her own. Simple chores felt heavier. Climbing stairs tired her out, and sometimes she forgot where she put things. She knew deep down that it was time to move. One morning, after watching the birds outside her window and drinking her tea, Mrs. Ellis made up her mind. She took out the phone book and found the number for a local real estate agency. Her hand shook a little as she dialed, but her voice was steady when someone picked up. "Good morning," Mrs. Ellis said. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I'd like to talk to someone about selling my house." The receptionist on the other end sounded surprised but cheerful. "Of course, Mrs. Ellis. We would be happy to help you. Can we send someone over this week?" "To take a look?" Mrs. Ellis agreed. They set up a meeting for the next day. The news spread quickly at the real estate office. A 97-year-old woman wanting to sell her home was not something they heard every day. The manager decided to send 2 of their best agents, Lisa and Mark, to handle the sale. Lisa was in her 30s, full of energy and kindness. Mark was older, experienced, and always careful with his work. Both were curious about meeting Mrs. Ellis. On the day of the visit, the weather was bright and sunny. Lisa and Mark drove to Mrs. Ellis's home, talking about what they might find. They guessed the house would be old, maybe in need of repairs, maybe even messy with boxes and old furniture. But as they pulled up in front of the house, they were surprised. The house looked well cared for. The grass was trimmed, the flower beds were full of color, and the porch was swept clean. A wind chime made soft music near the door. The curtains in the windows were neatly tied back. It was clear someone still loved this home, Mrs. Ellis answered. The door herself. She wore a simple blue dress and a pearl necklace. Her white hair was neatly brushed. Her eyes were bright with curiosity. "You must be Lisa and Mark," she said with a small smile. "Thank you for coming. Please come inside." Lisa and Mark thanked her and stepped into the hallway. Inside of the house was even more surprising. It smelled like fresh bread and flowers. The floors were clean, the furniture polished, and the walls were covered with old family photos. There was a sense of peace in every corner, as if time itself had slowed down here. Mrs. Ellis invited them to sit in the living room. She brought out a tray with tea and cookies. Lisa was touched by her hospitality. "Mrs. Ellis, your home is beautiful," Lisa said. "You've taken such good care of it." Mrs. Ellis nodded. "Thank you, dear. This house has been my world for a long time. But now I think it's time for a new chapter," Mark gently asked. "What made you decide to sell now, if you don't?" "Mind me asking?" Mrs. Ellis took a sip of tea before answering. "I'm getting old," she said softly. "My children live far away, and it's hard for me to keep up with everything. I've decided to move into a retirement community. I want to spend my remaining years around people, making new friends. But I hope whoever buys this house will love it as much as I have." Lisa and Mark smiled, feeling moved by her words. They saw the courage it took for her to make such a decision. After tea, Mrs. Ellis led them on a tour of the house, showed them the dining room with its polished table and lace tablecloth. She pointed out the old clock that had belonged to her parents, the hand-painted plates on the wall, and the bookshelf full of classic novels. Every object had a story. Lisa listened closely, feeling like she was stepping back in time. They moved upstairs to the bedrooms. The master bedroom still had her late husband's hat on a hook by the door. The guest room was filled with quilts, each one sewn by Mrs. Ellis over the years. In the small study, there were piles of letters tied with ribbon, Some of the letters were from her children, others from her husband during the war. There were medals and old photographs of him in uniform. The agents felt honored to see these treasures. It was clear the house was more than just wood, and Brickett was the keeper of Mrs. Ellis's life. As they finished the tour, Lisa noticed a door under the stairs that was locked. "What's in there, Mrs. Ellis?" she asked gently. Mrs. Ellis smiled, but it was a mysterious kind of smile. "Oh, that's just the basement. I keep it locked. Old habits, you know. Maybe one day I'll show you what's down there." Lisa and Mark exchanged a quick look, curiosity growing inside them, but they didn't want to pry. They thanked Mrs. Ellis for the tour and promised to do their best to find a buyer who would respect her home's history. That afternoon, back at their office, Lisa and Mark told their manager about Mrs. Ellis and her house. They spoke about the lovely garden, the neat rooms, the stories in every corner, and the locked basement that seemed to hide a secret. Their manager agreed to help find the right buyer, someone who would see the true value of the place. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ellis sat by her window, watching the sunset. She felt a little sad, but also hopeful. She wondered who would live in her house next. She hoped they would care for the garden and listen to the wind chimes, and maybe one day discover the secret she had kept safe for so long. As the first day of her new journey came to a close, Mrs. Ellis felt ready. The house that had held her past would now be the start of someone else's future. Let me know if you'd like to continue with part 2. Of course, here is part 2, expanded to about 1,300 words. In simple and engaging English, third-person style, with no inappropriate content, Lisa and Mark returned to Mrs. Ellis's house the next morning. They wanted to take more pictures for the listing and get to know the house better. As they parked outside, the sun was shining through the tall trees, and the flowers in the garden were swaying in the gentle breeze. Everything felt calm, as if the house itself was welcoming them back. Mrs. Ellis opened the door with the same kind smile. She invited them in, offering fresh tea and a plate of homemade biscuits. Lisa was always touched by how warm and friendly Mrs. Ellis was, and Mark admired her quiet strength. As they drank tea, Mrs. Ellis shared more about her life. She told stories about raising her 2 children in this house. She talked about the cold winters when her husband would light a fire and they would all sit together playing board games or reading books. She smiled as she remembered the laughter and the love that had filled every room. After tea, Lisa and Mark began walking through the house again, but this time they paid more attention to the small things. At every shelf, every table, and every wall had something special. On the living room wall there were dozens of family photographs, all neatly framed and dust-free. There was one picture of Mrs. Ellis as a young woman, standing next to her husband in front of a big car. Her eyes looked just as bright then as they did now. On a side table, there was a stack of greeting cards from birthdays and holidays past. Some were from her grandchildren, filled with colorful drawings and sweet messages. Mrs. Ellis picked up one card and read it aloud. "To Grandma, I love you forever." She smiled softly and put the card back in its place. Lisa noticed a beautiful quilt folded over the back of the sofa. The quilt was covered in tiny, careful stitches and bright colors. "Did you make this?" Lisa asked. Mrs. Ellis nodded proudly. "Every square is a memory. This one is from an old dress I wore to my daughter's graduation. This one is from the curtains we had in the kitchen when the children were small." She gently traced the edge of the quilt with her fingers, remembering each moment. Mark was drawn to a large bookcase filled with books. Some of the books were very old, with faded covers and pages that had turned yellow over time. There were novels, poetry books, and even a few cookbooks with notes written in the margins. Mark picked up a book of poems and found a small flower pressed between the pages. He smiled, wondering how long it had been there as they explored more rooms. Mrs. Ellis continued to share her memories. She showed them the dining room, where she used to host big Sunday dinners. The dining table was polished and ready, even though it hadn't been used by a big group in years. There was a cabinet filled with hand-painted plates and cups that had been passed down from her mother. Each piece had a story, and Mrs. Ellis remembered them all. In the hallway was a small table with a box of letters. Mrs. Ellis explained that these were love letters from her husband, written during the war. She smiled as she described how they would write to each other every week. Some of the letters had little drawings and poems. Lisa listened closely, touched by the love that was still so alive in Mrs. Ellis's heart. The agents noticed that every room felt alive with memories, but they also felt a sense of sadness. It was clear that Mrs. Ellis missed her family and the busy life she once had. Still, she tried to look forward, hoping that someone new would fill the house with laughter and love again. They moved on to the small study, where the desk was covered. With notebooks and photo albums, Mrs. Ellis opened one of the albums and showed them pictures from family vacations, birthday parties, and school plays. There were pictures of her children playing in the garden, her husband mowing the lawn, and family pets curled up by the fire. Lisa felt like she was seeing an entire life unfold in those pages. As they walked through the guest room, Lisa noticed more handmade quilts. Each quilt was different, with its own colors and patterns. Mrs. Ellis explained that quilting was her way of keeping busy and remembering the happy times. She often gave quilts as gifts to friends and family, and she had taught her granddaughter how to sew. Mark peeked into a small closet and found a box of old toys. There were wooden cars, stuffed animals, and a set of building blocks. Mrs. Ellis laughed as she told them about her grandchildren, coming to visit and playing with those toys for hours. She remembered the sound of little feet running down the hallway and the joy of hearing their laughter. After seeing the bedrooms, Lisa and Mark found themselves back in the hallway, standing near the locked basement door. It was painted white and looked ordinary, but both agents remembered how Mrs. Ellis had smiled mysteriously when they asked about it the first time. Lisa decided to ask again, gently, "Mrs. Ellis, you have such a wonderful home and so many special things, we couldn't help but notice the basement is locked. Is there a story there too?" Mrs. Ellis gave a little laugh and nodded. "Oh, there are many stories in this house, dear. The basement is? Well, it's a place I haven't shared with anyone in a long time. Maybe one day, when the time is right, I'll show you." Mark smiled, respecting her privacy. "You're ready, Mrs. Ellis. We're just happy to help however we can." They finished their tours, taking careful notes and pictures of every room. Lisa made sure to write down all the details about the antiques, the quilts, the books, and the family memories. She wanted to make sure that anyone who saw the listing would understand how special the house really was. As they were getting ready to leave, Mrs. Ellis walked them to the front door. She thanked them for being so kind and for listening to her stories. Lisa and Mark both felt honored to have met her and to have seen the world she had built inside her home. Driving back to the office, Lisa and Mark talked about what they had seen. They agreed that this was not just a house, it was a living history, filled with love and memories. They wanted to find a buyer who would appreciate everything Mrs. Ellis had created at home that night. Mrs. Ellis sat by her window, looking at the stars. She felt a mix of emotions, sadness for the memories she was leaving behind, but also hope for the future. She wondered what the real estate agents thought about her and her home. She smiled, knowing that she had given them a glimpse into a life full of stories. The next day, Lisa and Mark started working on the listing, writing about the beautiful garden, the handmade quilts, the shelves of old books, and the special warmth in every room. They decided to call the house a home full of history, hoping it would catch the eye of someone who loved stories as much as Mrs. Ellis did. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ellis continued her daily routine, watering her flowers, reading her favorite books, and sometimes standing quietly at the basement door, remembering all the secrets it held. She felt ready to share her home with someone new, but also knew that some memories would always be hers alone. The story of Mrs. Ellis's house was just beginning to unfold, and Lisa and Mark knew there were still more surprises waiting to be discovered. Let me know if you're ready for part 3. Certainly. Here is part 3, expanded to around 1,300 words in simple, engaging English. Third-person style, and with no inappropriate content. A few days later, Lisa and Mark arrived at Mrs. Ellis's house for another visit. This time, they came with more papers to fill out and a camera to take extra photos for the listing. They were also carrying a quiet excitement. Ever since their last visit, they had been thinking about the locked basement door they didn't. Want to push Mrs. Ellis? But the mystery made them both curious. Mrs. Ellis greeted them warmly as usual. She had baked apple pie that morning, and the sweet smell drifted through the house. Lisa and Mark sat at the kitchen table, enjoying a slice and chatting about the beautiful weather outside. Mrs. Ellis looked happy but a little more thoughtful than before. As the meal finished, Lisa gently asked, "Mrs. Ellis, we always notice how carefully you keep everything. You must have a lot of memories in this house." Mrs. Ellis smiled and nodded. "Yes, I do. Every corner holds a story. Some stories I tell, some I keep for myself." She paused, looking at the basement door. From the kitchen, she seemed to be thinking hard about something. After a quiet moment, she stood up. "You know, I think it's time," she said softly. "Maybe you both should see the basement. I've kept it locked for a long time, but if I'm really leaving, maybe it's time for someone to know what's down there." Lisa and Mark looked at each other, a little surprised but excited too. "Only if you're sure, Mrs. Ellis," Mark said gently. She nodded and walked slowly to a small drawer in the hallway. From inside, she pulled out an old shiny key on a ribbon. The ribbon was faded and soft, as if it had been held many times. Mrs. Ellis walked to the basement door, her hand trembling just a little as she slid the key into the lock. There was a soft click, and the door swung open with a quiet creak. The stairs down to the basement were wooden and narrow. A faint smell of old wood and dust floated up. Mrs. Ellis turned on a light. It glowed warmly, inviting them down. Lisa followed first, then Mark, and finally Mrs. Ellis herself, holding the rail as she stepped carefully down each stair. At the bottom, the agents stopped and stared wide-eyed. The basement was not dark and empty as they had expected. Instead, it looked almost like a secret museum. Along every wall, there were shelves full of unusual and beautiful objects. There were old paintings in golden frames, some of them covered in cloth to keep them safe. There were glass cases holding collections of coins, some shiny, some old and worn. There were stacks of leather-bound books, and boxes full of postcards from all over the world. Lisa walked over to a table where wooden toys were lined up trains, dolls and animals, all hand-carved and painted with bright colors that had faded. Only a little with time. There was a small rocking horse with a blue saddle. Mark stood near a tall cabinet filled with jars of seashells, fossils, and even some small strange stones.
Ow.
Everything was labeled neatly in Mrs. Ellis's careful handwriting. There were also old diaries stacked together with ribbons. Each diary had a date on the cover. Lisa picked up one at random. It was from 1943. She flipped it open, finding careful notes, drawings, and even pressed flowers inside. On the far wall, Mark found a collection of old clocks, each one different. Some were tiny, made to sit on a shelf. Others were large, with shining faces and moving parts inside. When Mrs. Ellis saw him looking, she explained, "My husband loved clocks. He collected them everywhere we traveled. He could fix any clock, no matter how broken." Lisa was fascinated by the artwork. She lifted the cloth from one of the bigger paintings and gasped, showed a quiet village, painted in rich colors, with every house and tree carefully drawn. Lisa asked in wonder. "My husband," Mrs. Ellis said, her eyes shining with pride, "he painted all these over the years. Some are from places we visited, some from stories he heard as a child. He never wanted to sell them, but he was proud to share them with friends." Lisa and Mark realized then that this was not just a basement. It was a lifetime hidden below the house, filled with treasures and memories. Every shelf, every box, every corner was a piece of Mrs. Ellis and her husband's story. Mrs. Ellis walked over to a chest in the corner. She opened it slowly and took out a large, thick scrapbook. She laid it on the table, and Lisa and Mark leaned in to see. The book was filled with photographs, tickets from trains and ships, maps, and small souvenirs like pressed flowers and dried leaves. There were photos of Mrs. Ellis and her husband standing in front of famous landmarks, smiling and holding hands. There were notes about every trip, where they went, what they ate, who they met. Mark pointed to a faded photo of Mrs. Ellis and her husband beside the Eiffel Tower. "You really did go everywhere," he said, amazed. Mrs. Ellis nodded. "We loved to travel. We saved for years, then took a trip every time we could. Each thing you see here has a story. They spent nearly an hour listening to her stories, looking at the objects, and asking gentle questions. Mrs. Ellis explained that she and her husband started collecting when they were young. Sometimes they bought things at small shops or traded with friends they met during their travels. Over the years, the collection grew and grew. When her husband passed away, she kept everything just the way he left it. It was her way of remembering him and their adventures together. Lisa asked, "Why did you keep it all a secret?" "These things are amazing." Double quotes. Mrs. Ellis smiled. "Suppose I was waiting for the right time. I wanted to keep it safe, just for us. But now, as I get ready to leave, I think it's time for others to see and maybe enjoy them too," Mark said. "These are priceless, Mrs. Ellis. Some of the paintings, coins, and clocks might even be worth a lot of money. Have you ever had anyone look at them?" She shook her head. "No, never. My husband and I collected for love, not for money. But if they could help someone or bring happiness to others, that would make me proud." Lisa took a few pictures of the basement and its treasures. She promised Mrs. Ellis to be careful with the photos and not to share anything without her permission. Mrs. Ellis agreed, trusting Lisa and Mark. Before they went back upstairs, Mrs. Ellis handed each agent a small souvenir. To Lisa, she gave a tiny hand-carved cat painted white with blue eyes. "He carved this the year our daughter was born," she explained. To Mark, she gave an old coin from Italy. "My husband found this on our first trip to Rome. He always said it was lucky." Lisa and Mark were both deeply touched. They promised to help Mrs. Ellis find someone who would love the house and maybe the treasures, said as much as she and her husband had. Back in the living room, the three of them sat quietly, feeling as though they had shared something very special. Lisa and Mark realized they were not just selling a house, they were helping share a legacy, a whole world of love, adventure, and hidden stories that had lived in the basement all these years. As they left, Mrs. Ellis felt lighter, almost relieved. She had kept her secret for so long. Now she knew it was in good hands. Outside, Lisa and Mark walked to their car in silence for a moment. Then Lisa turned to Mark and said, "I'll never forget this day, will you?" Mark shook his head. "Never. Some houses are just houses. But this one is a treasure chest." And as they drove away, both agents began to think about what would come next, not just for Mrs. Ellis, but for themselves, changed by the kindness and quiet magic of an old woman's home. Ready for part 4? Absolutely. Here is part 4, expanded to about 1,300 words, written in simple, engaging English, third-person style, meant with no inappropriate content. After Lisa and Mark's visit to the basement, news of Mrs. Ellis's hidden collection began to quietly spread among people in the real estate office. First, Lisa only told her manager about what they had discovered. She described the paintings, the coins, the clocks, the journals, and the countless items that filled the secret basement. Her manager was amazed and advised her to take care and make sure everything was safe. The team at the office realized that this sale was not just about selling a house. It was about sharing a piece of history. Lisa called Mrs. Ellis to check if she would allow a professional appraiser to visit. Mrs. Ellis thought for a moment and agreed. She wanted to know if any of the items were valuable, not because she planned to sell everything, but because she hoped that, if possible, the treasures might help someone or support a good cause. She trusted Lisa and Mark, and that made the decision easier. A week later, a kind and gentle appraiser named Mr. Simmons arrived. He was respectful and moved slowly, understanding that he was entering not just a room, but a memory kept alive. For decades, he wore white gloves and brought tools to examine the paintings, coins, and antiques. Mrs. Ellis watched with a quiet smile as Mr. Simmons moved from shelf to shelf. Pausing now and then to make careful notes, Lisa and Mark stayed. With Mrs. Ellis, listening as Mr. Simmons explained what he was doing, he spoke softly and made sure Mrs. Ellis felt comfortable answering all her questions. He looked closely at one painting, his eyes growing wide with surprise. "This one is from a well-known local artist," he explained. "It might be worth much more than you think." He found rare coins in one of the boxes and told Mrs. Ellis that they could interest collectors all over the world. The clocks, some over 100 years old, were in such good condition that they could be displayed in museums. The diaries, with stories and drawings from the past, held a kind of value that was not just about money. They were pieces of living history. As Mr. Simmons finished his work, he turned to Mrs. Ellis. "You have protected these things very well," he said. "They are special, not just because of what they're worth, but because they tell your family's story." Mrs. Ellis felt a sense of pride. She was glad she had cared for these treasures, and now she wanted to do something meaningful with them. That afternoon, Lisa and Mark helped Mrs. Ellis think about what should happen next. They discussed different options, keeping some things, giving others to family, maybe donating the rest to museums or charities. Mrs. Ellis liked the idea of sharing some items with the local museum so children and families could see and learn from them. Word started to spread beyond the office. A local newspaper heard rumors about the discovery and sent a reporter to find out more. At first, Mrs. Ellis was unsure about talking to the media, but Lisa and Mark promised to help her every step of the way. With their support, Mrs. Ellis agreed to speak to the young reporter, a polite woman named Rachel. Rachel arrived with a notepad and a gentle smile. She asked Mrs. Ellis about her life, her travels, how she and her husband had collected so many wonderful things. Mrs. Ellis told her about the joy of exploring new places, the excitement of finding a rare coin in a small shop, and the peaceful days spent painting or carving toys together. She explained how she kept the basement a secret because she wanted to protect the memories, and because she was waiting for the right time to share them. Rachel wrote down every word and took a few photos with Mrs. Ellis's permission of the paintings, the coins, and the special objects in the basement. When the story was printed in the newspaper, people across the town were amazed. Many said they had driven past Mrs. Ellis's house for years, never knowing the hidden world inside. The story touched the hearts of the community. Neighbors who had not visited Mrs. Ellis in years sent her letters and cards, thanking her for sharing her story. Children from a nearby school wrote her drawings and notes, telling her how much they loved hearing about the adventures she and her husband had enjoyed. The local history society asked if they could meet her to hear more stories. Lisa and Mark were also changed by the experience. They realized that sometimes the biggest surprises are hidden in ordinary places. They admired Mrs. Ellis's courage in opening up her life and felt honored to help her with each step as days passed. The museum director called Mrs. Ellis to arrange a special meeting. Mrs. Ellis, feeling both excited and a little nervous, went with Lisa and Mark to the museum one sunny morning. The director welcomed them warmly and showed them a space where some of Mrs. Ellis's items could be displayed for everyone to see. They talked about which paintings, coins, and toys might teach children about art, history, and travel. Mrs. Ellis was happy to know that her treasures would not just gather dust in a hidden room but would inspire others. She donated some of her husband's paintings and a few rare coins to the museum. In return, the museum promised to hold a special event to honor her and her family's story. That evening, Lisa and Mark helped Mrs. Ellis sort the rest of her collection. Some items she wanted to give to her children and grandchildren special, things that would remind them of their roots. Other items she planned to auction, with the money going to help a children's hospital and the local library. The thought made her feel peaceful, as if all the years of saving and collecting had found a true purpose. The home itself became even more special in the eyes of the agents. When they listed it for sale, they added a note about its history and the treasures discovered inside. Many people wanted to visit, not just to see the house, but to meet Mrs. Ellis and hear her stories. The day of the museum event finally came. Mrs. Ellis wore her best dress and her favorite pearl necklace. Lisa and Mark stood by her side as people from all over town came to thank her and look at the display of paintings, coins, toys, and letters. Children listened wide-eyed as Mrs. Ellis told stories of faraway places. Adults admired the beauty and care put into every piece. After the event, Mrs. Ellis felt content. She realized that, even though she would soon leave the house, her memories and her husband's art would stay alive in her town. Lisa and Mark watched her with pride, knowing they had played a small part in sharing something truly special with the world. As the sun set on the day of the museum event, Mrs. Ellis sat quietly in her living room. She looked around at the nearly empty shelves, the boxes ready to go to her family, and the house that had been her world for so long. She felt a mix of sadness and hope. The sadness of saying goodbye, but the hope of knowing that her story and her husband's would be remembered. Lisa and Mark promised to keep helping her until the very end. They would find the right family for the house, someone who would honor its past and fill it with new stories. The journey that began with a simple phone call had turned into something much greater. And as Mrs. Ellis closed her eyes that night, she felt grateful not just for her treasures, but for the kindness of strangers who became friends. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Part 5. Here's Part 5 expanded to around 1,300 words in simple, engaging English, third-person style. Without any inappropriate content, the day had finally come. After many weeks of preparation, the house was ready to be sold. Lisa and Mark had found a family who loved old homes and valued history. The family was young and full of energy, with 2 small children who were already excited to explore the garden and the rooms. Mrs. Ellis felt peaceful knowing that her home would be cared for and loved again. Before the family moved in, Mrs. Ellis held a small gathering in the house. She invited her children, grandchildren, Lisa, Mark, and a few close neighbors. The air was filled with warmth and a little sadness. It was a goodbye to a place that held decades of memories. People shared stories, laughter, and even a few tears. Mrs. Ellis stood quietly, watching as her home came alive one last time with voices and smiles. Lisa and Mark helped Mrs. Ellis pack the last of her things. Boxers were filled with quilts, books, photographs, and small keepsakes. Some treasures were to be given to her family, and others were going to museums or charities, as Mrs. Ellis had decided. She felt ready to start her new life, even though leaving her home was difficult. Moving day was bright and clear. A van arrived to take Mrs. Ellis and her belongings to the retirement community she had chosen. It was a place filled with friendly people, lovely gardens, and many activities. Mrs. Ellis had visited several times before deciding it was the right place for her. She was looking forward to making new friends and enjoying her days in comfort. As the van drove away from her old house, Mrs. Ellis looked back one last time. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, and the garden flowers seemed to wave goodbye. She smiled, feeling grateful for the years she had spent there and the memories she would carry forever at the retirement community. Mrs. Ellis settled into her new apartment. It was smaller than her house, but cozy and filled with light. She decorated it with some of her favorite quilts and photographs. Lisa and Mark visited her often, bringing news of the house and the community. The young family who bought the house took great care of it. They planted new flowers in the garden and restored the old wooden floors. They even promised to keep the wind chime that Mrs. Ellis loved so much. Sometimes they invited Lisa and Mark over for tea, sharing stories about the house and their own family adventures. Mrs. Ellis's treasures in the museum became a popular exhibit. Visitors came from near and far to see the paintings, coins, and toys. Children especially loved the stories Mrs. Ellis had shared, and many felt inspired to learn more about history and art. Mrs. Ellis felt proud knowing that her husband's work and their travels were helping others enjoy the past. With the money from the auction, Mrs. Ellis donated to the local children's hospital and the library. She wanted to give back to the community that had been her home for so long. Her kindness and generosity became well known. She received many thank you letters. Over time, Mrs. Ellis made many friends in the retirement community. She joined a book club, attended art classes, and even helped organize trips for other residents. Though she missed her old house sometimes, she found joy in new experiences and the company of others. Lisa and Mark often reflected on how much they had learned from Mrs. Ellis. They realized that a home was more than just walls. It was the stories, love, and memories that filled it. They felt lucky to have been part of her journey and to have helped share her life's treasures with the world. One afternoon, Mrs. Ellis sat in the community garden, watching children play. Nearby, she thought about her long life, the house she had loved, and the many adventures she had experienced. She felt a deep peace inside her heart. She knew that her story would live on not only in the museum and the house, but in the hearts of everyone who had heard it. and she was ready for whatever came next, with a smile on her face and hope in her heart. If you want, I can also help turn this into a full story or create outlines for new titles.